Greetings from Tokyo. My name is Daisuke. How are you doing? I hope you guys are all having a really nice day today. I wanted just to touch base with you about just a really cool thing that happened. I was very fortunate and honored and privileged enough to have appeared as a guest on a podcast, a film-related podcast, very recently, which is a film-related podcast, but specifically related to the Criterion Collection. And this podcast is called Criterion Now, and it's hosted by a really knowledgeable and just a nice guy named Aaron. And he is so filled with knowledge and so filled with enthusiasm for the Criterion Collection and just film in general. And I was very privileged to have appeared as a guest on one of the past episodes. So if you're interested, please, I would encourage you just to visit the Criterion Now podcast. Who knows, maybe some of you or many of you who are watching this video now are also listeners of the Criterion Now podcast. So you don't need my endorsement or encouragement to listen to it, I'm sure. But for those of you who don't know the podcast, Criterion Now, please, if you don't mind, if you have a free moment, please visit the page of Criterion Now. I'll leave a link below, and I encourage you just to take a listen. I was very fortunate because I was also allowed to talk a little bit about the film The Tree of Life. And as some of you may know, I put up a video a few days ago where I talk about the recent Criterion Collection release of The Tree of Life. So so if you're interested in a film-related podcast, where I appear as a guest, please check out Criterion Now. Of course, there are many other episodes other than the one that I'm guesting on. So please check out as many episodes as you can. It's a really great place to get news about the latest Criterion news and also reactions to them. So it's really interesting. So in a Criterion Now podcast. And this also led me to another question that was asked of me by a viewer about what kinds of film-related podcasts do I listen to. And I listen to quite a number, not as many as I should. I'm not necessarily the best in terms of knowing what podcasts are out there in the entire podcasting community. I really should know more, but I do have a number that I listen to, and it may be, if you are interested, I'll just leave links below. So that you might be interested in checking them out if you have the time. But anyway, these are just some of the ones that I listen to that are related specifically to film and to let's say the Criterion Collection or other films in the Criterion Collection. So first of all, there is the great podcast called Film Baby Film, and this is by my dear friend John at Film Baby Film, and he has such a wonderful knowledge and enthusiasm. And what I like about him is that he has guests on, and he is so respectful of the guests, and the guests are always so knowledgeable. You know, if he's talking about maybe All the President's Men, and he'll have lawyers come on, his friends who are lawyers. So this is great because All the President's Men has very specific legal issues about it, and so having lawyers on, I think, is very helpful, and it adds to a really great conversation. And John, as a host, is so gracious because he lets his guests talk and engage, and it's never a sort of a one-sided conversation, but it's very balanced, and he asks questions and he responds to comments that his guests make. And so it's not like he just asks a question and moves on. No, he'll ask a question, a comment will be made, and then he'll respond to that comment in a way that makes the conversation very organic and really pleasant to listen to. So Film Baby Film as a podcast, it's a really great podcast. I encourage you to check it out. Next is another great one. It's called The Magic Lantern. Now, this is a wonderful podcast by my dear friends Erica and Cole, and they are a real powerhouse duo because they have such a wide breadth of film knowledge that I would dare say that I think between the two of them, I would probably guess that they have probably seen they've seen, or at least they know of, I think, almost every film that has ever been made. Their knowledge of cinema is just beyond me. It's amazing. I learn something new every time I listen to their podcast, and they are never how should I put it? They are always thoughtful in their commentary. If they have a criticism of a certain film, they make sure they think it out and they think it through, and they make sure that we as the listeners understand what their thinking process is. They are very into providing detailed explanations as to the backgrounds of films and filmmakers, and they do it in a way that's very easy to listen to, very pleasant to the ear. Really wonderful educational experience listening to the two of them and their wonderful podcast, The Magic Lantern Podcast. Again, The Magic Lantern Podcast. This is one that you should be listening to. Next is Flixwise. Flixwise is wonderful. Lady P and Martin. This podcast is wonderful because the fundamental premise of this podcast is going through each of the films that appears on the 2012 critics poll that was conducted by Sight and Sound as to the greatest films ever made. So they're going through all the films, one film at a time. And along the way, they talk about other films, of course, not just the Sight and Sound critics poll films, but they do talk about these films in the order from number 1, Vertigo, to number 2, Citizen Kane, and on and on. So I don't know where they are now. I think they're still in I want to say they're in the 70s, 80s, or 90s or so. So they are really going through the list wonderfully so, and there's always a wonderful range of guests that come on. Sometimes you have film professors and scholars on, which is really wonderful, and you've got this great interplay, and Lady P as the host is always gracious, always enthusiastic, always honest, and I love her honesty. She knows when to, and if she's critical of something, she'll never be. What I love about her is that she is always enthusiastic, and whenever she's critical, she's never frivolously so. She's always very thoughtful in her criticisms, and it makes for a really just rich conversation, and one that I'm always so happy to listen to. And Martin too. Martin, my goodness, he's like one of those walking like film encyclopedias. He's like he's one of those marvels. I don't know, like there's a certain moment, there's a certain point where there's only so much information that I can stuff into my brain, and then there comes a point when everything beyond that just gets, it pushes other things out. So I can't keep more than a certain finite amount of information in my brain at one given time. But Martin seems to be like, he's got like a huge data bank in his mind of films that he's seen, and his recall is just extraordinary. Really, he's one of those one of a kind in the film community. So anyway, Flixwise, really awesome podcast. Please check them out if you haven't already. Next is one of my favorites is Complete Kubrick. Now, this is a podcast by my dear friends Travis and Matt, and they go through each of the films of Stanley Kubrick, one film at a time, and this long, just deep conversations with guests about every facet of these films. And they're very critical when they need to be, and they're very enthusiastic when they need to be, and they take this project and they look at the whole oeuvre of Kubrick, and they look at each film and how it stands in his oeuvre, in his canon, which is really insightful, because we're talking about a very important film director and film, let's say, figure in cinematic history, in modern American cinematic history at least. And so their commentary on each of the films is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I do understand also that they are probably going to do this kind of podcast project for other directors. So they've already completed the podcast series for Stanley Kubrick films. So I'm still at the edge of my seat waiting for their announcement as to what filmmaker they will tackle next. Please check them out. This is Complete Kubrick. Really fascinating and such insightful dialogue between them and their guests. It's really wonderful. It's just a marvel that they are willing to provide their insights and knowledge in a way that is so open and so wonderful to listen to. So the Complete Kubrick. Next is oh yes, this is one of my favorites. Good Times, Great Movies. So Good Times, Great Movies. This is my friend Doug and Jamie. The two of them are just talking about these films. I think their focus is on 80s films, and so they do a lot of genre films, which is just fascinating. Sometimes they do action flicks, sometimes they do cheesy kind of science fiction flicks, sometimes they do cheesy horror films, and it's just right up my alley. I love it. I think they did a podcast episode on the film Sleepaway Camp. Do you know that film, Sleepaway Camp? That I think for me is kind of like the creme de la creme of commentaries available with respect to the film Sleepaway Camp. I was just laughing so hard when I heard their podcast episode on Sleepaway Camp. It was probably one of the greatest podcasts I had ever heard about a film. And it was a film, Sleepaway Camp, so perhaps it's not to everyone's taste. I can appreciate that, but still, if you like that kind of film, you will be just so in love with these guys and their commentary and their podcast discussion of Sleepaway Camp and other films in the 80s. So Good Times, Great Movies. These guys are the real deal. They know their stuff, and you listen to them and you it's like I don't know, it's just so life affirming. How should I put it? It's like it makes me proud and happy to be a film lover, because if you have like such positive people like these doing a podcast, you know that the world is a good place indeed. So it's just so life affirming, and it's just so wonderful to know that there are indeed really great people like this out there in the world doing great work. So Good Times, Great Movies. Next is the wonderful podcast called Three Friends Go Criterion. The Three Friends Go Criterion. So this is Alberto, Mickey, and Brandon. Wonderful guys, really nice guys. And they are just talking about films. Mainly their discussion is about films in the Criterion Collection, but it's not limited to the Criterion Collection. But it's really wonderful because they are so funny and just so down to earth. And whenever I listen to their podcast, I feel like I'm listening to friends, and we're just talking and chilling out and just hanging out at a bar, maybe on a Friday night or something, and we're just having a beer together and just talking. Like they feel so like loving and warm and generous, and it's wonderful because they have this deep knowledge of great, sometimes obscure cinema, but they never let it show. In other words, they're never kind of snobbish about it. They're always very down to earth and so pleasant to listen to, and it's just like you're talking with your friends about great films. It's just hilarious. Some of their stuff is just hilarious. There's one episode there was some kind of like special like awards extravaganza show. I forget the title of the episode, but they were doing these kind of skits and songs, and there's all these references to film are just so super fast. It was like it was like one, I forget who it was. There was this wonderful tribute to like Fargo and True Coat, and they're talking about White Dog, and then they're talking about Javier Bardem, and just so much stuff that was going on, and Tom Cruise, and just all this wonderful film knowledge, and they're just endless, their enthusiasm. It's just wonderful. The Three Friends Go Criterion. So I encourage you, please, if you want to have a great time and laugh, and at the same time listen to some really deep discussions of films, mostly films that are in the Criterion Collection, listen to the podcast The Three Friends Go Criterion. It's just one of those great pleasant times. It's like I'm talking to friends on a Friday night. We're just sitting at a bar, drinking a beer, and just having a great conversation about wonderful films. The Three Friends Go Criterion. Next, I want to give a shout out to Criterion Reflections and also the Eclipse Viewer. So Criterion Reflections is a podcast by David Blakesley, and this is where he discusses the films of the Criterion Collection in chronological release date order. So not spine number order, but chronological release date order. So this is really fascinating because we get a sense of a historical progression, which is very important because it helps to understand these films when they're discussed in this kind of way, which helps to give it a historical context. And we are dealing with a number of films, so he is very slowly and surely and methodically going through each film, and his discussions are always very well planned, well prepared, highly insightful, and the presentation is top notch. It's really like listening to a professional film critic. So David's work is very valuable to the online film community at large, and in particular, of course, the Criterion Collection fan community. So I encourage you to, well, if you're watching this video, chances are you're interested in the Criterion Collection, and if you're interested in the Criterion Collection, chances are you've already heard of David Blakesley's name, so you certainly don't need my endorsement to be listening to his podcast. You're probably listening to it already, but if not, yes, his work is invaluable to me and to others like me. So please, David's work at Criterion Reflections is great. Also, he does a great podcast called The Eclipse Viewer, where he and Trevor are working through the Eclipse films. I think they have discussed all the Eclipse releases up to now, so perhaps we will next hear them when there is a new Eclipse release, whenever that is, if that is, who knows. But yes, the Eclipse films is a very important and interesting subset in the Criterion Collection catalog, and I think his podcast, The Eclipse Viewer, is perhaps the only work out there that discusses these films in depth and individually. And I think that on that basis alone, I think The Eclipse Viewer is one of the most valuable online resources when it comes to getting more immersed in the films of the Eclipse series. So the Eclipse Viewer is also very, very important. So there's the Eclipse Viewer, and there is Criterion Reflections. And also let me mention here too the wonderful Criterion Completion podcast. So this is a podcast by my friend, and his name is Keith. And the focus of this podcast, the Criterion Completion, is basically about themes and topics that are regarding the aspect of collecting Criterion. And Criterion collecting, of course, means collecting the DVDs, collecting the Blu-rays, but also collecting the various paraphernalia of the Criterion Collection. There are many facets of Criterion Collection, not just the films. There are also the Laserdiscs. And as you know, probably, I'm a huge fan of the Laserdiscs. I love collecting the Laserdiscs. The Laserdisc shelves are actually behind me, behind this set of shelves right here. So I love the Laserdiscs, so it's wonderful to have a podcast that deals specifically with this wonderful, very quirky hobby that I find myself engaged in, namely the collecting of Criterion Collection films. So it's wonderful to have a podcast like that. So the Criterion Completion. Yes, so Keith is a really wonderful, very knowledgeable host. And yeah, that is a wonderful podcast. I love that podcast very much, the Criterion Completion. It has a very special place in my heart as a collector of Criterion. And speaking of that, there's a wonderful network of podcasts called the Criterion Cast Network. So if you go to the Criterion Cast Network, you'll find podcasts within that network. So the ones I mentioned before, so Criterion Now, Criterion Reflections, I think also Completion, I think, might be on there as well. But there are also others. So I encourage you to check out the Criterion Cast main page, and you might be able to find other podcasts there that are of interest, as well as past episodes of podcasts that were made in the past. And of course, because the Criterion Collection is so large and voluminous, of course, you should listen to all past episodes, or at least as many as you can, because they might talk about films that you're interested in now. So yeah, I encourage you to give that website a look and to explore if you have the time. It's really a wonderful, invaluable resource for anyone who's interested in Criterion. There are also a lot of reviews and a lot of other insights and information, news, and maybe insights as to newsletter clues and all that sort of Criterion Collection fun stuff. So please take a look if you have the chance. Okay, my friends, let me just end it there. So I hope that was very, well, I hope you enjoyed that. And perhaps I might ask you now if you have any suggestions or recommendations for me for any other podcasts, film related, that you think are worthwhile for me to listen to. Please let me know, and I'd be so happy to have a listen. I know that there are so many film related podcasts out there, so many more are being made and being introduced. So there are so many new ones out there as well. So if you have any suggestions or recommendations for me as to any film podcasts that I should be listening to, please let me know please leave a comment below, or you can try to reach me through other means. But yeah, if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them. Okay, in the meantime, I hope all of you are happy and healthy and well, and that you are watching a lot of great films. Until we meet again, my friends, take care. Cheers.